Hello, welcome to the webinar. Thank you very much for registering with us. And we've got three fantastic speakers for you today. We're going to start with Beth Jennings of Claws Out, who's going to tell us her experiences. We've got Louise de Waal from Blood Lions, who's got immense experience. So we've got loads of people that can answer lots of questions. Keira Powers is here with us as well, also from South Africa, and she can talk to you about responsible tourism. So I'm not going to take up your time. There's Q&A down the bottom. Please put your questions in there. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. And we'll start with Beth. Over to you, Beth.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen for the presentation. Can everyone see? Is that good for everyone?
Yes, that's great.
Perfect. Hi, so yeah, I'm Beth Jennings and I run Claws Out, which is a campaign against lion exploitation in South Africa. So I'm just going to take you through some slides about my personal experience and how I became involved in this campaign. So I focus on voluntourism, which is a fairly new term, which means a form of tourism in which travellers participate in voluntary work, typically for a charity. So if done correctly, wildlife volunteering can be ethical and it can benefit conservation. But however, well-known agencies continue to advertise and sell trips that are not ethical under the guise of conservation. I personally found that the relevant information is not always readily available to volunteers, and that's why I started my campaign. So how did I become involved? Well, this is me in 2015, and I travelled to South Africa to volunteer with lion cubs. I put a deposit on a trip that was called Live with Lion Cubs in South Africa, and I was told the trip was for conservation and that I would be raising orphaned lion cubs to prepare them for release into the wild. So I did do research before my trip, and I found some negative information about one park in particular. However, the agency that I booked through told me that I was not going to this park, so the one that I was going to was totally ethical. And it was one of the UK's largest gap year agencies, so I had no reason not to believe what I was being told. I paid £1,500 for 2 weeks of volunteering, which didn't include the flights and vaccinations and all the other stuff that goes along with it. And I was one of around 20 volunteers during those 2 weeks. So the red flags started kind of as soon as I arrived, and I went in a bit naively and a bit blind to what was going on. So I'm just going to share some specific instances from my trip in particular. So this photo is from day one when we were receiving our induction of the park. As you can see in the background, there's a small cage that you'd typically keep a dog in. In this enclosure, there were 5 lion cubs, 4 of them are pictured here, and we were told that these lions had outgrown the enclosure and there was no room to move them into the next one. So for a few days, we would have to put them in the crate overnight from when the volunteer shift ended at 5 p.m. until 8 a.m. the next morning. All 5 of these cubs had to be put in that one single crate with no access to food or water the entire night. So this is why they couldn't be moved into the next enclosure. As you can see from this picture, I was still blissfully unaware of what was going on, and I was happy to be surrounded by lions as I thought I was helping at this point. So the next age group of lions, this isn't even all of them in this enclosure, sadly, but we had to wait for these to be moved until the young cubs could be moved into this enclosure. So a few days after, we were introduced to this lion cub here, which at the time was 12 days old. We had to lure the adult lions out of its enclosure to check on it and to check that it was healthy, despite the fact that none of us were qualified to do so or to make that call. And we were accompanied by rangers into the enclosure, which we had to search for the lion cub, and then within a few days it was removed and males were put back into the enclosure to start the breeding again. So by my second week, I'd been in touch with some online campaigners and started to realise what was going on. They advised me that I'd just take as many photos as possible and document my time to use it afterwards. So as you can see in this photo, there's 2 lion cubs that had been rented from a nearby facility for tourist interactions. These 2 lion cubs were 2 weeks old, and they would be used in this handling from 9 AM until 5 PM when the park closed. Another aspect of these volunteering parks is something called walking with lions. So this is where tourists are taken out into the nearby bush to experience lions, as they like to say, in their natural habitat. So these lions are a lot older and are basically just perform tricks for the tourists in return for a piece of meat, as you can see on the end of the stick here. Louise is going to talk about the insanity behind this and the fact of how unsafe it is, and tourists are given sticks like the one the ranger is holding to defend themselves against a full-grown lion, which, as you can understand, is just absolute madness. So I've got a short video here of the enclosure that these lions are kept in, and this is one of 2 enclosures on this park in particular. So these lions are used for the walking with lion activities. Now, tourists are not allowed in these enclosures, but as you can see from this videos, the volunteers are. I actually only found this video on one of my memory sticks yesterday, and I'm still blown away that I was ever stupid enough or allowed to go in this enclosure with these lions. So that was my time volunteering. As soon as I returned to the UK, I knew that I couldn't ignore what had happened and what I had seen and learned during this time. I felt absolutely devastated that I'd been involved with this when I thought I was contributing towards conservation, and really I was doing the opposite. And I felt stupid and I felt guilty about what I had done. So I launched Claws Out to try and raise some awareness. In the lead up to my trip, I posted all over my social media about what I was going to do, and I basically just wanted to make sure that everyone who had seen and liked those posts knew the truth about what had happened. So Claws Out gained traction quite quickly because at the time there was not many volunteers speaking out about this experience. So I was introduced to some amazing campaigners, and Claws Out became a full-time job, which I'm really proud of. And I also launched the Claws Out Pledge, and I had some amazing UK agencies sign up to basically pledge that they'll never advertise or sell these cub petting trips to their customers. In 2018, I was granted funding by Born Free Foundation and Olsen Animal Trust to create a short film about my experience. So just to end, I'm just going to show the trailer for that film, and we'll be able to provide the links if anyone wants to share it, obviously for educational purposes. I'm just going to share that now and hope that it plays.
Every year, thousands of volunteers and tourists head to South Africa and visit lion facilities, usually self-described as a sanctuary, to cuddle, bottle feed and walk with lion cubs. Often these parks will state that the lions have been orphaned or that their mothers have rejected them. None of this is true.
There's a very brutal chain of exploitation that begins with the breeding and goes all the way through to either lion bones or the canned hunt.
They estimate that the volunteering industry is worth approximately $173 billion a year.
Students coming in believing they're contributing to conservation, when in fact they may well just be contributing to the exploitation of these animals. It's a very, very soft, cuddly storyline to sell, but of course those people, they go home and they don't follow the actual the life of that particular lion cub.
Thank you. So my website is claws-out.com, and I've got resources available if you want to look at the pledge, or if you know companies that would like to sign the pledge. And there's also a page about ethical volunteering trips that you can take in South Africa. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. That was, well, it was quite a horrendous experience to have, and thank you so much for starting Claws Out and raising so much awareness already. That's really good. I'll pop the links into the chat as well. I know the video didn't play perfectly there, but I'll pop in the link to that video as well, so that everyone can catch up with that. Our next speaker is Dr. Louise de Waal of Blood Lions, and she's going to talk us through the numbers. So what these voluntourism, what the volunturists do. They bring their money into South Africa, and Louise is going to tell us what happens to that.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Beth. You know, I think we do need these sort of personal experiences. I just need to, and what I want to start with, right, I hope that is looking okay. So what I want to start with is a very short clip, and it kind of summarizes what Beth has been talking about. So the clip kind of summarizes the life cycle of a captive bred lion, because what we've seen from Beth, her experience, is sort of the starting point of the life cycle of a captive lion. We haven't really seen what happens after that, but they become part of that whole exploitative cycle, including canned hunting, including the trade in their bones, and also the life trades of these animals. So let's have a little look at the predator breeding industry in South Africa and how that has grown from sort of the late 1990s when it started, and it has been legally allowed to grow. And it started maybe with about 50 facilities with less than 2,500 lions in sort of 2005, and currently the total is 666 facilities with nearly 8,000 lions in 2019, or at least that is the official figure. However, we do believe that is a gross underestimation, and we're looking at probably closer to 10 to 12,000 lions in captivity in South Africa. Now, if we compare that to the lions in the wilds and the managed population in small reserves, that stands at just over about 3,000. So we have 3 to 4 times more lions in captivity than we have in the wilds. But we don't actually know the exact size of the population because the population has never been properly audited. And the numbers are also in a continuous state of flux. So the facilities, as I said, they've also grown hugely, and the official figure is 366. Including all the hunting facilities, we have identified over 450 facilities. And if we look at those, that includes sort of approximately 177 facilities that are open to the public. And 130 plus offer some kind of interaction with their wildlife, and in many cases lions, because that's what we focused on. And over 60 offer volunteering opportunities. So there's a huge number of those facilities in South Africa that bring in volunteers like Beth because they want to do good. They want to do something good for conservation, but in most cases they're conned. So a lot of these facilities that we talk about, they house lions, but they also house a lot of other and breed another a lot of other big cats, including cheetahs, leopards, caracals, servals, and then exotics like tigers, jaguars, pumas, and we even crossbreed lions and tigers, and we call them ligers. So yeah, lions are not the only captive big cats. There's a lot more, and we have literally no idea the total number. We're probably looking at something in excess of 15,000 big cats in South Africa in captivity. So if we look at the commodity chain, and Beth has actually mentioned a couple of things already, like loaning cubs from other facilities. There's a huge flow of animals between all these facilities. So we have a breeder that breeds specifically, then they might rent them out, loan them, sell them to tourist facilities. Tourist facilities sell them back to breeders, and those breeders, they might be involved in hunting, or indirectly they may sell to a hunting outfit. Or they might be involved in the lion bone trade, or sell their lions to facilities that deal in the lion bone trade. So it's one big web of all these different aspects of this industry that are all interconnected. And the tourist facilities are kind of the spider in the middle of that web, because they kind of make it tick. They actually provide a lot of the revenue to the breeders. So a lot of the facilities might say, oh, but we don't do canned hunting, or we don't sell our lions for the bone trades. Now that might be true, but they will be selling to other people. There are middlemen involved. So they are all connected, and they know they are connected. It's not like they're the innocent party. So let's have a little look, because Beth was talking about those tiny little cubs of a few days old. So what is actually happening? Those animals are being ripped from their mothers. A lot of the time, people are told that they're either orphaned, abandoned by their mother, or mother didn't have enough milk. Now, if that was true, I think lion mothers would be the worst mothers in the world to generate literally hundreds of these orphaned cubs every year, because the huge number of cubs that you saw in Beth's presentation, that is just one facility. And we saw that we have over 60 facilities that offer volunteering. We have over 130 facilities that offer some kind of interaction. So the numbers, the total numbers are huge. So why do they do that? First of all, it takes the mother back much quicker into her breeding cycle. So it means that she can fall pregnant much sooner and have 4 to 5 more litters compared to her wild cousin. So they become real breeding machines. They're just pregnant, produce cubs, cubs are taken away, they fall pregnant again, a few weeks, maybe months later, have another litter, and so on and so on and so on. So that is a very important reason. And secondly, the reason is because you can bring in volunteers, and you can pay paying tourists who would love to interact and look after these poor little orphaned cubs. So that is the reasoning behind the start of the life cycle. Now let's have a little look, because we need to follow the money here. So Beth said, I think if I was correct, £1,500 she paid for 2 weeks. When we look at, and I did a quick look, Dr. Ross Harvey wrote an article, and he looked at a wide range of different volunteering places, and the prices, they range from between 120 to nearly 1,500 euros a week. So on average, a volunteer that would stay for a month would pay 2,100 euros a month. Now, some of these facilities don't have just 1 or 2 volunteers. They have 20, 25, 30 volunteers. Now, if you do start multiplying that amount, that is an enormous amount of revenue that these volunteers actually generate. So that is the first bit. It's the money that is generated by these volunteers. What I would like to say here is that it has also a negative impact because it actually can take away jobs from local people as well. So that's another aspect. We can do a similar sort of sum on the revenue from cup petting. So the price range for cup petting is anything between €4 to over €140 per person. So let's have an example here. One facility that has on average 11 lion cups, attracting 480 visitors per day, each paying €4. That is a revenue of nearly €500,000 a year that is generated by lion cubs. Same, and I just have put this in because the cheetah cubs are following a similar pattern, also used for petting, also used for walking, for photo opportunities. Similarly, 2 cheetah cubs, nearby facility to where I live, attracting up to 180 visitors a day, paying €14 each. That makes even more money, €770,000 a year. So these are substantial amounts of money, especially when you translate that to rand value. Now, a lot of these facilities might tell the visitors and the volunteers that their lions are not sold into the canned hunting or the lion bone trade, but they actually stay at their facility for life. Now, again, we should just do the sums. It's all a matter of numbers and see what that means. So a smallish facility would probably have maybe 4 cubs in their petting facility. Life cycle of a cub, 3 to 4 months in a petting facility, in a petting enclosure, and then it will move on to the next stage. So that means they need 3 times a year, they need a fresh supply of cubs. So that already generates 12 cubs per year for that one facility. Now, the age of a captive lion, if they're healthy and well looked after, they can live at least 15 years, if not longer. So looking at the lifespan of one captive lion, in that lifespan, they would generate 15 times 12 is 280 lions. So they would have, 180 lions. So they would have nearly 200 lions within the lifespan of one lion's life to look after. Now, looking after that number of mature lions is hugely expensive. Something that Beth also sort of pointed at is actually the health and safety. There is no transparency within this industry in terms of what happens within breeding farms and the working conditions, and in particular the farm workers. I think in terms of working conditions for volunteers and the tourists as well, there's a little bit more information that comes out, but for the farm workers there's really not much transparency. But we do know that there are predator attacks happening, and also there is a high risk of zoonosis as well. And working with predators is dangerous. You know, cubs up to a certain age are okay. You might get a nasty scratch, but you know, as soon as they get a little bit older, they're strong animals. They're predators. There's a substantial risk involved. Now, this is not the most up to date. There's even more attacks, but it gives you an indication of the attacks that we know of because they've been actually reported in the media. And if we look at that bottom right corner, we can see that 65% of the attacks happen with tourists and volunteers, and 25% with farm workers and 10% owners. Now, if we go to the block above it, we can see that 25% of those attacks are actually fatalities. They lead to people's death. So this is not a joke, and this is involving lions, cheetahs, and also tigers. So males, females are involved, adults, children. So there is a substantial risk of attack as well, as a volunteer, as a tourist going onto these farms and interacting. Now, living through the COVID-19 pandemic for nearly a year, it's over a year already, we felt we had to look at the health risks associated with the commercial lion breeding industry, because we had no idea what that meant in terms of potential zoonotic diseases. So last year we carried out a review of existing literature and looked at what pathogens are associated with lions and what diseases. Now that actually raises a lot of concerns, because we looked at 150 different peer-reviewed scientific papers, and we identified 63 different pathogens, including parasites, viruses, and bacteria. All pathogens that can affect lions' health. It can affect other animals' health, but it can also affect humans' health. So associated with those pathogens, we identified 83 different diseases and clinical symptoms. Now, that has led us to come up with what we now call the SIG5. So basically, those are 5 serious diseases that can affect the human health. And there's 2 vector-borne tick-borne diseases. One disease that is transmitted through the tsetse fly, and 2 that are transmitted more directly to people. And the African sleeping sickness that is actually transmitted through tsetse fly is actually on the list, the World Health Organization's neglected tropical diseases list. So yeah, some potentially serious illnesses that we can actually get from these lions as well. What we need to keep in mind as well is that a lot of these, or I should say all of these studies were actually either wild lions, or they were lions in a captive environment like zoos and sanctuaries. So those are captive environments where they are actually looked after quite well. So welfare is a real issue in terms of the chances of these diseases actually being transmitted and spilling over to humans. So from that point of view, we believe that given the conditions in those lion farming operations and the high concentrations of animals in these enclosures, sometimes even different species in the same enclosure, that the industry is likely and could play a central role in the emergence and the transmission of zoonotic diseases, not only to people, but also to wild animal populations. So yeah, it's just scratching the surface, to be honest, but these are all things that you have to keep in mind if you are thinking of volunteering with captive wildlife. So I want to end on a slightly higher and more positive note, because yes, you can do something. You can ask the right questions. You can ask, do you breed? Do you hand rear? Do you allow interaction? Where do these cubs come from? Where do these adults go to? And if they cannot answer those questions properly, then those are all huge, big red flags. So empower yourself with knowing the right questions to ask. And then following on from that, you can make the right choices and responsible choices there are some really good organizations out there, ethical volunteering agencies, and Beth already sort of showed a few names that were in one of her slides. You can support and volunteer with organizations that work with animals in their natural habitats, or bona fide conservation projects, or support true sanctuaries. Now, of those, there aren't as many as those captive facilities, but do your homework, ask the right questions, and I think that there are responsible and ethical choices that you can make, and then you can truly make a difference and support conservation of these magnificent animals in the wild, in one of our beautiful national parks or private nature reserves. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was it's really quite shocking, the numbers that are involved here, and you went through some risks that I'm sure lots of people haven't really thought about, but the welfare issues we're aware of, but also the risk to humans there. And in an era of COVID, you would think that zoonotic risks would be another one of these things that would mean this industry has to stop. But on a much more positive note, as you were turning into, we now have Keira Powers, who's going to be able to talk very much to that and what people can do. So we know what the situation is, and I'm going to hand straight over to Keira. We have got a couple of questions coming in as well, so we'll get to those. Thank you very much, Keira. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Yes, I see the two questions, and I hope that when I'm finished, I probably will have answered those, but obviously would happily direct an answer to those questions if you feel they haven't been addressed. So let me share my screen now and get that presentation up. Okay. Right, is that all coming through to you as it should? All right, so it's a perfect lead, and thank you to Beth and to Louise, because the tourism industry clearly has a lot to answer for. And it was in response to this that our organization, SATSA, which is the Southern African Tourism Services Association, got involved and stepped into the fray, as it were. As an association, we're not a government body, we're not a legislative body, and we can't regulate. We are an association of members. And our members could have included operators and businesses that offered such things as you've seen on the screen up to now. And then they also include true sanctuaries and ethical practices. And so apart from the obvious dilemmas that tourists face in making choices, there was also within the industry a lot of anger that people trying to do good work were getting tarnished and painted with the same brush from organizations that were completely unethical. So we took on the unenviable task of trying to come up with a guide for our own industry and then for tourists. And so this is what I'm going to speak to, because it takes us a long way into answering a lot of the questions. So we published a guide at the end of 2019 called Evaluating Captive Wildlife Attractions and Activities. And voluntourism sorts of facilities would fall into this. So the purpose was, well, I can capture it in this one sentence: to assist the owners of captive wildlife experiences, visitors and buyers, and those would be your tour operators and your agencies, in making informed decisions based on sound ethics to support good practice only. So that one sentence has so many parts that I actually want to address. So firstly, the guide tried to assist 4 different sectors of the market. I'm not going to read these sentences here, just to show you that in the guide, it does go into detail to explain how it can assist visitors, owners, buyers, and then representatives of government agencies and so on. So it spans quite a broad spectrum of an audience. And then obviously the whole point was to make informed decisions so that you don't go around in a void of information. Then very important to us was that it should be based on ethics, right? So why would we bother going into a whole ethical framework for a guideline around tourist attractions? And this was a critical point for us because we always ran the risk of being subjective and being accused of coming up with guidelines that had a hidden agenda. So we had to find an ethical framework that would then enable objectivity and that we could use to reference all our decisions against, to eliminate informed opinion being the basis of our tool and our guide. And those opinions would come from us as the committee and the researchers and from SATSA. It was also really important to have something that would make the work consistent. So whether we were still involved in 10 years' time or not, as the writers of this guide, it shouldn't matter, because if the principles remain and the ethical framework is timeless, then the decisions can always be referenced back to that, and it doesn't matter who wrote it or who was in the room at the time. So then the point was to get to a very practical tool, and that's where I'm going to lead up to with the rest of this. So make no mistake, there were many guidelines already out there to assist tourists. And we also realized if we were going to do this work, we should add value and not just repeat what has already been done. So we were looking at key defining differences that would help the marketplace more than what was already available to them, which clearly wasn't helping enough. So we wanted to look beyond the welfare. If you were choosing an organization based on whether they looked after their animals well or didn't, to us that was less relevant than really where they came from and where they were going to. And that is pretty much because we are at the coalface. We are in South Africa. We are where it all happens. So we know more maybe than foreign tourists. We know that there are issues of source and destination, and it's not just about having nice animals in one place, and that's the only place you ever see them. So we were looking at the full life cycle of wildlife in tourism, and with that, trying to look beyond just the wildlife in the system, but really to the ethics and the transformation of the system. And that is a process, and we're still really just at the beginning of that process. We hope we will see transformation, and we think there are signs of seeing it, but we understand that this is going to be a long, long journey. I'm not going to speak to these 4 points that have just come up on the side because it's all there in the guide if you would like to read it. But basically, we researched a lot of ethical frameworks and ethical approaches. We chose an integrative approach, which was selected because it is founded and based and designed around the African context. And clearly, that was very important. We didn't want to import something that just became kind of an imperialistic or even colonial kind of idea of what Africans should do in Africa. We needed something to come that was homegrown and from ourselves. But what it boiled down to was a founding statement for this guide, which is that the interests of animals should not be subordinate to the benefits humans derive from their existence. And that's really the lens through which we started to design a guideline and design a tool for people to use. To reach there, we isolated and thrashed out 8 essential questions that were based on this ethical approach. And I'm just going to speak to 3 of them that would probably be the most useful to know about. So the first one is one of the 3. Easy question, probably obvious, and yet it seems that people don't really think about this. Is it in the best interests of animals to be in this facility or to be in captivity? Now, if the answer is yes, that would be because they have been rescued from a dire situation, or they were injured, or they are in a true sanctuary. So there can be reasons why it is in the best interest for animals to be in a facility. I'm going to skip the other 4. You may read the other 3. You may read them if you like, and go to number 5, which once the animals are in that facility and you want to go and visit or you want to go and volunteer, is the activity that the animals are participating in that facility natural to them? Simple question again, and it gives you a very easy way to identify whether something is good or bad. The next question I will just highlight is number 8, because this is very, very often the marketed, the advertised reason why a facility exists. It will be so-called because there is education value or conservation value in that facility or in holding those animals in captivity. And it's the most traded excuse. So it's one that you really have to look at very carefully and then answer whether there isn't a better way that the same education could be achieved. Considering in Africa that we have national parks, we have enormous conservation areas where you can learn about animals and learn about conservation. And in theory, there should be no need to go to somewhere where animals are kept in cages. So that's just 3 of the 8 questions that we used. And by applying these to an enormous range of activities and facilities, we were able to, long story, and the guide will give you more detail of how, but kind of be able to brand and compartmentalize places that, or activities that were unacceptable, a little bit unclear, or obviously acceptable. So with the ones that fall into the unacceptable zone, clearly we don't encourage anyone to go there because the animal's interests are completely subordinate to the benefits humans are deriving from their existence. With the unclear one, it's really tricky. So we acknowledge that there's a level and a degree of self-moral judgment that you would have to apply. But mostly with those, we encourage ask more questions, interrogate before you make a final decision. And then obviously the ones that fall into the acceptable zone, we particularly want to channel support in that direction. Because we're not a legislative body and we can't make regulations and we can't outright ban anything, we fall into the power of economics. Follow the money. If you strangle the money channel off from unacceptable places, you've seen the number of lions, they cannot afford to keep them. If no one goes there anymore, we don't have to shut them down. They just will close because they can't survive. Similarly, conservation efforts that are dying for funding and desperately need support to do the work that they are doing, we don't want people to waste money in unproductive spaces with animals. We want to get that spend consolidated with the true conservation initiatives. So that's where we were trying to go with this guide. Out of those questions and in those zones, we actually only came up with 5 activities involving animals in the tourism space that fell into the unacceptable zone. And that might be surprising. There were many that fell into the unclear zone, and that's probably understandable. But the idea is that with time, we would be able to reduce the unclear zone, grow the green zone, and shrink the red zone. So of these 5, again, in the guide, it goes into great detail about why each of these things are unacceptable, how they were identified, the background, ethical reasoning, and so on and so forth. But for now, just to know that anything involving performing animals is to be avoided. Any tactile interactions with infant wild animals. Doesn't matter if it's a cub or not. An infant animal, there's no good backstory to that. Walking with predators or walking with elephants. Completely unacceptable. And then tactile interactions now, not just with infants, but with any predators or cetaceans. So that would be adults or infants. And lastly, of course, the riding of wild animals. So those activities were clearly identified. What was really important to us is that tourists make decisions on the fly. You're having a great holiday, you go into a tourist office, you see a whole bunch of brochures, you pick up the brochures and you think, oh, this looks good. And then a little prick of conscience goes, I wonder. Now, you're not going to take a day out of your holiday to go onto the internet and start researching whether this place is good or bad and ethical and whatever. So you need some assistance to make your decision quickly, right? So we didn't want our guide and our research to sit in a drawer gathering dust. We wanted something that had high utility in our marketplace. So this tool is to assist you to rapidly choose what to support and avoid. And to do that, it takes you through a sequential list of questions that firstly will immediately identify a true sanctuary or a rehabilitation center. And in that case, you don't even have to go any further. If they fit the criteria, you've got your tick, great. You don't have to go through the rest of the decision tree. We encourage you to support them. If they don't meet those criteria, you have to then progress through a couple of disqualifying criteria questions. If any of those disqualifying criteria fit onto the activity you're looking at, they immediately are discarded into the avoid zone, and you need to go no further. However, if they seem to pass those disqualifying criteria questions, Then there's a final sixth question in 3 parts that looks at sort of a grading criteria. So there aren't true sanctuaries and rehabilitation centers, but if they pass these gradings, then you can think, all right, for now we can support them and do so with caution, with eyes open. And once you're there, you take a close look and possibly publicize or report back if you think that they have been falsely advertised and don't in fact meet those criteria. So here's what the tool looks like. Question number 1. Okay, so firstly, as you can see, the bottom line, you've got the gradient of avoid on the left to support on the right. Vertically, you've got at the top, the first, the questions 2 to 5 are your disqualifying criteria, and then question 6 gives you a grading criteria into the yellow zone, which we obviously would like to see move into the green zone. So if you look at question number 1, basically those bullet points are the criteria for a true sanctuary. So Rebecca, this answers your question. A true sanctuary does not breed. So you are absolutely right. Any lion breeding facility cannot be a sanctuary. And that's by anybody's definition of a sanctuary. So you look at all those bullet points, you see, does that facility comply? Like with all of those, it passes. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a yes answer, drops straight down into support, off you go. If it's on the left and says, nah, it doesn't fit all those criteria, you go to question 2, and you start to consider the activities that the animals are used in, right? And here we come to those ones that I listed: performing, tactile interactions with infants, tactile interactions with adult predators or cetaceans, walking with predators or elephants, and riding of wild animals. If the facility is not doing any of those things, you can go onto the right-hand side, you say, no, they're not, and you start to consider the destination, where these animals are going to end up. If they are doing any of those things, you can see the red arrow straight down to avoid, your decision's made, you don't go there. So if they don't, then you say, where are they going to end up? In canned hunting, in trade of body parts, which is a growing industry, and this is something any of you that are interested should look more into, because it drives more than hunting does. Trading in body parts is a bigger business than hunting. And then, of course, there is the illegal trade. Outside of the quotas that are allowed, is there any trade going on? So again, if they're doing that, you head straight into the avoid. Are they breeding? So you're of lions and tigers. Now, of course, tigers are not indigenous to Africa, and yet because of the success of attracting visitors with lions, they've now branched into tigers. All right, so if none of that is happening and you're in your green answer on the right-hand side, you start to consider the marketing. Question number 4, is there any misleading advertising, deceptive behavior, or a lack of transparency? Just something just doesn't look like they're making a full disclosure. That's question 4. Any of those answering yes, they're out. No, you go to the next question and you look at their compliance. Do they have all their permits for their various industries? An aquarium has to have a permit, obviously zoos, sanctuaries, they will have organizations or associations or government agencies that they have to have permits from. So if they have all their permits and there's no evidence of illegal operations, then you get to basically your position. They've passed everything so far, and yet they weren't a true sanctuary to start with. So at that stage, you look at the grading criteria. And this is where source comes in. Were the animals wild captured? Were they purchased? Were they bred in captivity or traded commercially from breeders to populate the facility? And the only commercially traded, legit commercially trading, is where there's recognized conservation programs going on and facilities exchange animals or purchase animals for gene pool and so on. So, so you look at how did that facility get their animals in the first place. Then with the activities of the animals involved in, was their freedom of choice to participate in that activity limited or restricted in any way? In other words, are they being forced to do this or engage with humans? If they're in a tiny cage and you put a human in it, they don't have a choice but to be there. And the last ones are they being kept in those facilities or in captivity purely for entertainment or tourism purposes? Because that's basically to make money rather than actually in the interest of the animals, rewilding them or having fully rehabilitated them, getting them back into their natural environment. So that's how the tool works. And this is available on a PDF format that you can download to a smartphone. And it's exactly the same questions, but except that it's 6 pages and each page is a question. And if you get to the right hand, let's say the answer, then you just scroll to the next page and it'll take you to the next question, and you scroll to the next page, and ultimately you'll end up in the green zone or the red zone with your answers. All right, so that's the tool. And basically with that, SATSA as a, we've got over 1,300 members just in South Africa. So that really showed what our approach and position is. And we took it with the best interests of the future of our industry in mind. We need tourism in Africa and we need it to have longevity. So we need tourists to come. And if we are doing things unethically, tourists are going to go to other destinations instead. So we encourage everybody to use the tool to come to your own decisions. And that's very important to us as well, that you have agency. You're not passive. We don't need to just give you a list and tell you what you can and can't do. You are responsible for your actions as a tourist and as a buyer. So this tool, I think, empowers people to be responsible for their own choices and decisions as well. So on that vein, then let me just go into the industry of voluntourism, where you're basically trying to travel to make an impact, do something useful and good with your spend. And to us, there is a difference between traveling with impact and volunteering. So the first question to ask is not actually what you would think, like, is this place legit or not? It's actually, why? Why do you want to volunteer? And if in that self-reflection, you're able to identify that it's to make you feel better about the time you're going to spend on holiday, you want to spend it usefully, about your travel, if you're going to pollute the atmosphere, you want to feel good about it, about where your money is going, you want to give your money to worthy organizations rather than just a commercial hotel, and also feel better about your life, that you're doing something that matters. Then you need to also realize that there is no cause in Africa that can't get the work done by locals. And this is something that Louise mentioned, and this is something I don't think is spoken about a lot. So think about it. Volunteering charges you money. That's why it is there, for the money. So you are basically a fundraising vehicle for them. And that is not a bad thing in some cases, because funding is critical, and I don't want to discount that. It's a bloodlines clause out. Everybody in the NGO space and conservation space will know that funding is critical. So fund. That's my message. If it's the funding that is the ultimate goal of the volunteering, then fund. That is great. Don't create a marketplace for the manufacturing of orphans. So that brings me to my next point about travel with impact and volunteering, this idea of orphans. So if you're attracted to volunteer with something that is telling you they've got orphaned animals, so if the orphans are furry, understand that nature doesn't leave much life behind. Nature is brutal. Lion cubs, you do not pick up orphaned lion cubs in the wild. The only reason they would be orphaned in the first place is if they lost their adults, in which case they would die very quickly. The other reason is if a new male came into a pride, in which case they kill the cubs from the former male. So you don't find orphaned lion cubs wandering around to rescue and rehabilitate. The only way cubs end up in captivity is if they are bred there. Then, of course, if it's humans, orphans, to go, you're volunteering in an orphanage, there's so much literature, I'm sure probably most of you are aware, that you are doing more harm than good with the constant abandonment issues that are imposed on young children when their volunteers come and go and come and go and come and go, and they are constantly abandoned after they've already been abandoned by their parents. Okay, enough about that. So the best way, if you want to help Africa, the best way is to support jobs. Employment is the biggest gift you can give any country in Africa. Jobs are everything. Our economies need it. And only when people's basic needs are met will conservation ever matter. We can't beat the conservation drum when communities are hungry and don't have work and they can't send their kids to school. So we need the jobs that you are doing as volunteers. Tourism is also one of the easiest and most direct ways to create jobs. One of the reasons why is because it absorbs unskilled people into the economy. So my message is that just by traveling, just by your spending money on every link in the tourism value chain, you are making a difference. You don't have to volunteer to feel good. Travel is actually, don't know if you ever thought of it this way, is actually a really good act. It's a really good thing in Africa. Okay, that's the only a reference point I can speak from. So, you know, as we've said, volunteering to work for an entity takes that work away from locals who could do that job and get paid from that job. So rather feel fine about whipping out your credit card and paying to go into a facility or going into a reserve or paying a conservation levy or buying the curios or going to the local restaurant, because if you're paying for that, then the employers can afford to pay the locals to do the work that you were going to do, right? And then just a little note to I acknowledge that there's a shortage of skills in a higher skills band, perhaps. And those jobs are often not the sexy ones. They're not the ones out in the sunshine with the animals. They are the ones in the office doing the hard yards in an under-resourced place, usually, otherwise they wouldn't need you. So that's actually where the need is. And that doesn't make for a very attractive or sexy holiday. So people don't do that. And agencies don't sell that. Okay. And then lastly, if you are looking at volunteering in the conservation space, then now that you've seen the tool, I think you could agree, you use the tool and you will be able to select a worthy facility for your time and your money. Right, that's me from the tourism side.
Thank you so much, Keira, and brilliant to leave it on a much more positive note, what people can actually do. I think we've got some questions to that as well. I know you've answered one of these questions already. There is somebody asking if there's a list available with good organisations. I don't know if, Louise, if you could come in on that. I think that is still...
Yeah.
You know,
it's a very difficult one to create lists. As I was saying, you know, just from a line perspective, we are looking at so many facilities, and we've also been asked, oh, naming and shaming, is there a list of bad facilities? Now, there is a list, Volunteers in Africa Beware on Facebook, and that is being updated quite a lot by information that volunteers give to the organizer, the owner of this page. So if you want to just do a quick check on whether that organization is listed, they do good, bad and ugly, I think, sort of categories. So there are some organizations listed that are good, and then a little bit like Keira was talking about as well, sort of a little bit of a grading from the sort of the good to the really ugly ones, and the sort of the grading of facilities in between. I think they've got about 4 different categories. So it is up as a pinned post on that Facebook page, Volunteers in Africa Beware. So that's quite a good resource for people to do a quick check. But I think it's always good to do your own homework as well. And if I may just add something to the question of sanctuaries and rehabilitation centres, be aware as well, a lot of these facilities will call themselves a sanctuary, because a sanctuary or rehabilitation centre, that there isn't anything illegal about calling yourself that if you're not. So the fact that somebody calls their facility a sanctuary doesn't necessarily mean they are. So a sanctuary doesn't breed, they don't trade, they don't allow interaction with the animals, and they provide a space for life for that animal in their facility, and they will look after it. Welfare of the animal and enrichment of the animal is always top priority in true sanctuaries. And there's not many true sanctuaries in South Africa, I can assure you that. I think also the difficulty becomes where people start branching out. They may have started as a rehabilitation center, and then they keep some of their animals and they become a sanctuary at the same time. And then they're involved in a breeding program. And it's those kind of overlaps that makes it really very murky for people to navigate that whole space. Because they are a sanctuary, they're a rehabilitation center, but they breed. And, you know, just the fact that they might call themselves a rehabilitation center and a sanctuary and a breeding center all at the same time should actually throw up a very large, big red flag. So just be aware that people do use these terms to their own advantage, but not necessarily being one as such.
Thank you, Louise. I think you're probably the best person to answer. I mean, I could answer myself, but someone's asking if you can elaborate on the links between tourism facilities and trophy hunting industry. Of course, it's where these industries started out. It was, you know, to make cheap trophies for people who were wild lions. Hunting wild lions is expensive, so people started breeding them so they could shoot them in enclosures, and this was a cheaper way to get your trophy. But obviously it's expanded since then. It's a money-making business, as we've accounted from the very beginning, with these cute cubs and the sheer numbers involved in that, to providing animals for the bone trade. But I will hand over to you, Louise.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, as you say, actually trophy hunting and shooting a lion in the wild is A, very expensive, B, it takes at least a couple of weeks, and it's not actually that successful. I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think you're looking at 50-60% success rates, whereas you offer these kind of captive hunts, you only need a couple of days, and they're much cheaper, and they're virtually 100% guaranteed. So it's a completely different beast. So it all started exactly with providing that cheap, quick fix. And then they realized that in order to offer a lion in a hunt, you need a fairly mature lion. These animals are not like chickens. They don't grow up to maturity within a few months. These animals need several years. So you have to make them pay their way, if you like, for them to be kept up till that point where they are mature enough and beautiful enough, and their trophy and their mane big enough to actually attract that interest from trophy hunters. So that is where the tourism space and the volunteering came in. So it sort of starts off with those cubs. They're being taken from their mother. They're hand reared by often involving volunteers. They are used in cub petting facilities that generates an income. Then when they're too old, they might be used in walking activities. And they then reach a point where they outlive that sort of interaction, because any sub-adult of, over a year becomes pretty dangerous to work with. So then they go back often to a breeder or a keeping facility that holds them, that breeds with the females. So as I was saying, I showed that sort of diagram, all these facilities, they have a role to play. So some might not breed, but they do all the interaction. Others, they might keep them and sell them on to the trophy hunters once they're actually mature enough. And the lion bone trade also was a spin-off initially from the trophy hunting industry, because for the trophies you only need the head and generally the skin, so nothing was done with the skeleton. Now, tiger bones were already used in Southeast Asia in traditional medicine, and there were all sorts of restrictions put on the breeding and using of tigers for those practices, and obviously wild numbers plummeting, so they saw an opportunity there to use the lion bones, and that trade, that part, has actually become a whole separate entity within that whole chain, because some lions are purely bred for their bones at the end of the line. So yeah, I think you have to kind of think about it as a spider's web, and all these facilities, they sort of exchange animals, sell them, they go back and fro, they might be bought from one facility, go back to another, that facility then sells them onto a middleman who might sell them on to a hunt outfitter, and then that hunter, the trophy then goes to a taxidermist. So there's like all these different people involved, they're all linked, they all have relationships, and the tourism plays that kind of central role in making that industry economically viable and keep that industry spinning and growing. I hope that sort of explains it a bit better.
I think it does. I think it's.
I was going to say, if I
Sorry,
could just jump
Beth,
in as well.
would you like to come in?
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that as well. I think
Absolutely.
it's important. A lot of these places that offer volunteering as well tell the volunteers that the lions are released into the wild, and will of course deny that they're being sold into hunting. And if you look at the stats that were given earlier, it's obvious that if facilities were releasing lions into the wild on the scale that they claim to be, then wild lions wouldn't be consistently declining, and they would want to be shouting about it from the rooftops. So if you ask them for evidence that their lions are being released into the wild and they don't produce that evidence, then that was the biggest red flag that I think I should have at least seen at the time.
Thank you, Beth, for that insight. Of course, you know, it is these people are not truthful people. They are in it for the money. So you cannot, unfortunately, believe what they say. We've got one more question about other cats being involved in this, the sort of cheetah experiences and the hybrids that you mentioned before, Louise. Do you want to just touch on that?
Yes, I think the cheetahs are a really interesting one. The hybrids is not a massive industry. I think a lot of the hybrids, the ligers, are actually often bred because they are quite big animals, so they actually create a bigger and heavier skeleton. So I think a lot of those animals are actually sold into the lion bone trades. But I think the cheetahs is an interesting one because people don't quite see the same harm in interacting with cheetah cubs or adult cheetahs. And, you know, we all know the term ambassador species that are used for photo opportunities, often taken to wedding venues. I've seen cheetahs being used as bearers of the ring, cheetahs being used in photo shoots, cheetahs being used in films, in advertising, you know, all sorts of activities. And again, it's all about the fact that they can make money off these animals. And people don't see quite the same harm because they are generally not part of the sort of that life cycle where they're being hunted in a captive hunt or part of the lion bone trades. But cheetahs are actually born into a life in captivity. They're also ripped from their mothers. They're also hand-reared by volunteers. They're then interacted with to raise money for the facility. Again, one facility might breed them, they loan them, or they sell them, or they exchange them to another facility that offers the tourist interactions. Once they outgrow that, they might go back. Basically, they are generating this very well-behaved, habituated ambassador. You know, when you interact with these animals right from a small cub, and the cheetah is obviously not such a big and strong, powerful predator as a lion is, but it doesn't mean to say that they're not dangerous, because there have been very nasty attacks involving cheetahs as well. So a lot of these cheetahs, they go through that whole system here in South Africa. They're being habituated, and then they become these quite well-behaved ambassadors, and then they're actually sold as adults to all sorts of zoos and breeding facilities around the world. A lot of the zoos overseas, they will also offer these pay and play schemes where the visitors can also interact with those animals. So a lot of these cheetahs are actually born into a life in captivity. Only very few, like with the lions, there's like a handful a year that are actually being released back into the wilds. And I think we have to be very careful with some of these releases. The same with lions. The fact that they say, oh, but the lions are being released back into the wild. There's a lot of issues, you know, not only the possible compromised genetics of these animals that you might actually release into the wild, but the very facts that we may actually be releasing an habituated predator into a wild situation that can then create more human-wildlife conflicts. And we know that a lot of the predators, cheetahs and lions, they all get, or not all, but many are killed as retaliations in human-wildlife conflicts. So yeah, there's lots of issues with actually releasing captive bred predators into wilds, if that is already possible. So yeah, the cheetahs, be very aware. Use the tool that Keira was talking about, because you can ask exactly the same questions, whether it's a lion cub, whether it's a tiger cub, whether it's a cheetah cub. Ask the same questions. And why do we breed? The breeding is not the problem in the wilds. What the problem is that we don't have enough safe habitat for these animals. That is one of the main threats. Then there is not enough prey species for these animals in the wild. Human-wildlife conflict, those are some of the threats in the wild, not issues with breeding. They're quite capable of breeding in the wilds. We just need to be able to protect them better in their own habitats. And I think one way of doing that is where tourism has got such an important role to play. Because through tourism, we can financially support those wilderness areas.
Oh, thank you so much. This was really incredible and informative and horrific when you look at the sheer numbers of animals and the amount of money these companies make just exploiting animals and misleading people. It's really staggering. And I'd like to thank all of you, Dr. Louise de Waal with Blood Alliance, Beth Jennings with Claws Out, and Keira Powers from SATSA and Spirit of Africa for joining us and taking your time to provide all of this information and your expertise to all of us and the viewers. We will be we've recorded this and we'll be sharing it again. So anybody who might have missed it, we'll have the link available. And if there's any questions that you might, any of our viewers may think of afterwards, just pop it in the event page on our Facebook page. You can put it there or email us at info@animalrights.nl or info@animalrights.ba, and we can get you a personal answer from any of our panelists. And also, I'd like to point out, Beth, we started with Beth, and she participated in this and was misled, but she grew aware of what was happening. And then from that experience, started Claws Out and began to educate people. So for each individual, there are things that we can do. We can take steps if we feel that we have been misled, or understand that something is not how they've presented it. There are ways that we can help, and things that you can do to help shut it down and bring awareness. So thank you, and thank you, Siobhan, for co-hosting with us, Animal Rights, and Rowena for doing all the background hard legwork.
Thank you again. Thank you to all our wonderful panelists. It's been brilliant hearing from you. And like I say, any questions that we haven't got to, do pop them into our event pages and we'll get answers to you. Thank you very much for all those that have answered. I think we've answered most of the questions. I think there's a couple there. But again, just thank you very much to Louise, to Beth, and to Keira, and to my co-hosts at Animal Rights. Thank you very much. And thanks for listening.
And thank you. It was great. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Right, good night, everyone.
Thank you.